Hello, we are live. I'm joined today with my good friend TJ Martinell, who is a novelist, a journalist, and like myself, he is also a history buff. And we are going to be discussing the Battle of Gettysburg, the nuances of it. This is the anniversary of the third and final day of the battle. So we are going to be talking about it, giving our armchair general legs a bit of a stretch. So, for those of you who don't know, the Battle of Gettysburg was considered by many to be, quote unquote, the turning point of the war. Some people said it was, some people said it wasn't. I'm in the camp that it was. And it was a 3-day battle that started largely by accident. And interestingly enough, as you know, it was a kind of an accident of history. And it ended up being, in many ways, a decisive battle of the war. And there's a lot been written about it, shall we say. It's probably the most studied battle in human history, partly because it defined our nation. It reintegrated the South after that. I mean, you know, interestingly enough, despite the fact that the Confederacy was dealt a decisive defeat in that battle, they continued to fight for almost another 2 years before they surrendered at Appomattox, right? So
that's the interesting thing is when people talk about like timelines, it's like when the Titanic struck the iceberg, it was going to sink, but it had 2 more hours. So people had a hard time when they were being told to get into the lifeboats. They had a hard time reconciling the fact that the ship appeared like it was fine, and that I don't really want to get into that icy cold water in this little lifeboat, but that's reality. So yeah, like it was, I think.
Well, the thing that really pissed most people off about the fact that the Titanic took another 2 hours to sink was we had to watch Leo run around the ship all that time, you know, and it was like, could you just put it in the fucking water already? Because I'm sick of watching this fucking guy.
I mean, it's kind of like with the Germans. I mean, Rommel knew, like he said, the war will be won on the beaches of Normandy. And when they lost the beaches, it was over. Like he knew that. He knew that the war was lost. There was a whole bunch of guys. That's why they did the whole Operation Valkyrie thing where they're like, there's no way we can win now. So it's the same thing with Gettysburg. Gettysburg was really where everybody understood that the war couldn't be won, but they weren't willing to surrender, which is really odd. From a pragmatic point of view, like just for me, if I had been the general, I'm not trying to like.
We can arm. That's what it's about. We're armchair generals now.
Well, here's the thing. I don't know what was going through their minds. I don't know where they were at. I don't know the full context. But here's the thing: you lose that battle, it's time to like negotiate surrender. Like you acknowledge, because what happened in the next 2 years that was good for the South? It was the same thing with the Germans. Like, what was the point of fighting after you lost the beaches of Normandy? Like you were going to hold out for 2 years. You were going to inflict some major serious blows to the Allies, but you were going to lose the war. So negotiate while you still have something to negotiate. And that was the problem, is like the South could have negotiated very good terms after Gettysburg. You know, you get your troops over the Potomac, you get them into the South, and then say, we want to discuss peace terms. There's no reason why they would say, why they would have said, no, we want to continue the war. The war wasn't as popular in the North as people want to say it. And nobody's going to say, yeah, I want to continue sending our sons to die for that. So that's where I'm like a little, I think there was like this pride, this sense of pride with like, we will give in only when it's like painfully obvious we can't win. But the problem is, like, from a pragmatic point of view, there was no way to win. So like, what are you fighting for? It goes back to I think it was St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas who said like just war theory. The only way, like he had a bunch of requirements for fighting a just war. One of them was you fight when you have a chance of winning. But for you to continue a war where you have no chance of winning is immoral, because you're only prolonging the suffering and deprivation. of your people and whoever else is fighting. So that's where I like from Lee, I think he knew that the war was not going to be won. He even, I think after the battle, he offered his resignation and they said no. He was kind of like saying, guys, we're not going to win this.
Well, Lee, from what I understand, Lee knew that the South could never outfight the North in a long, drawn-out battle. And the reason basically the Battle of Gettysburg started because Lee invaded the North. I mean, it took place in Pennsylvania. And the reason for that was he knew that there was huge anti-war sentiment in the North. They had people back then, this is a hard mindset for modern people to get their heads around, but the majority of the people didn't really see themselves as quote unquote Americans. They saw themselves as, they identified from the state they were from. They didn't, people from Pennsylvania saw themselves as Pennsylvanians, and Virginians saw themselves as Virginians. Northern Virginians saw themselves as Northern Virginians. I mean, that was the mindset that people had. So this idea of most people in the North were like, let the South do their own thing. Some historians argued that if the Civil War never happened and the South seceded, that within 30 years they would have been begging to come back into it. I don't know if that's true or not, but you just look at the economic powerhouse that the North had become, and let's say there was a Cold War that existed between the North and the South. Economically, the South would have been, really hurt by that. You know what I'm saying? Because the Industrial Revolution that was going on and such, all the new technology that was being invented, and the North just with its huge swelling numbers. But so the point was of the reason for the invasion was to force to turn public tide against Lincoln, and I believe he was up for re-election then, wasn't it? I don't so if the public opinion turned against him, the North would have just said, fuck it, do your own thing. We've lost so much blood and treasure anyway. Go ahead. I mean, there was draft riots in New York City. The city was shut down for 3 days. I mean, Lincoln opened up fire on Manhattan. It was crazy. Oh, I lost TJ. Hold on a second. Oh my God, I lost him. Let me send him another link. Oh, let's see. Are you back, TJ?
Yeah, I'm back.
I lost you. Okay, I don't know what happened. Yeah.
No. Something happened. Like it accidentally. Okay, it should be bringing. Is it showing my avatar right now?
No.
Oh, what the heck? 1 second.
It's showing your name though, TJ.
Okay, that's not acceptable. Okay. I'm looking for another avatar to. You have to log in or something. What? Okay, that's bullcrap. To answer your question, I hate not having an avatar because I
can send you another invite. How's that?
I have the link. Let me enter in back in again. 1 second.
Okay.
I'll be back in a second, guys.
Okay, and while we wait, so I don't know. It's funny. I was rambling on, and I didn't even realize poor TJ had been disconnected. So I hope he heard me. But let's see. Okay, let's see. Bring him back, and there he is, and he's got his.
There we are. Hey. Anyways, to answer the question, yes, and the fact this is. Gosh, I feel like I'm stepping on. I'm walking into a landmine. People were like, "Oh, the South seceded over slavery." Yes, that is true. I wouldn't argue over that. I'm not arguing with South Carolina. I'm not arguing with that. Oh, that's not the debate. The question is, why did the North invade? And it had to do with the fact that the South was reliant on the North for manufacturing because, as John was pointing out, the South. It's so funny that they did the 1619 project, the fake New York Times, fake news, the communist bastards. Our wealth was built on. Okay, why? If our wealth was built on slavery, why was the South poorer than the North, which had no slavery? Like
Right.
you're not making any like your case is not being well made at all. And the reason is because the institution created but anyways, the North had the manufacturing. So the South was relying on that because of tariffs that prevented cheaper goods, or at least at the very least goods from England and other countries from coming in. Because the North imposed tariffs, they were not free trade. The South was free trade, and so because that would have forced the Northern companies to lower their prices so that they could compete with foreign competition. So that's, I mean, guys, so that's why they wanted the invasion. Lincoln, I think, you know, if you look at Lincoln and look at his behavior, I've got a very nuanced view. I don't think he was as evil a man as the South would say. I don't think he was a saint, but his behavior, people always say, well, what do you mean? Look at how he reacted when the South lost. His response was, you know, we're going to do amnesty. We're going to go easy on them. We're going to have them readmitted to the Union as soon as possible. Like, that's not how a guy who genuinely hates people behaves. That's not how things would go down now. So I think he was driven by ideology. He was a nationalist. He had a very nationalist view of the country. And I think he was, you know, for all the claims by a lot of like lost cause people, like he was evil or whatever, like, yeah, but he could have had all those people executed for treason. Like, look at any civil war in any other country. He didn't behave that way. I'm not saying he was an admirable guy in a lot of respects, but like, look at how he responded to victory.
No, it's true. He actually was criticized by the fact that he was so, let's say, didn't go out and seek vengeance, or he didn't see the end of the war necessarily as something to celebrate. He was immediately
he
kind
played
of saying,
Dixie.
we have to mourn our bed.
When they won the war, he had Dixie played. Like, this is where I get a little frustrated with guys who are like, you know, pro-Southern or whatever. They're like, oh, Lincoln was a bad guy or whatever. It's like, that's not the behavior. Like when Lincoln said, I'll behave as if they never left, I don't think he was lying. I just don't think he was making that up. I think he genuinely had a nationalist view, and his view was the South never left. Like they didn't.
I think that it's interesting because, you know, because of it, he was assassinated. We don't really know how he would have treated the South in any sense of long term.
Well, that's yeah, exactly. I think I think he would have run into a lot of. I honestly believe his view by Southerners would have actually gotten better, because there, you know, I'm not praising this film, but there was that film, The Birth of a Nation, that was by the D.W. Griffith. It was like a milestone.
1915.
Yeah, because of the cinematography. Yeah, but it was based on this like pro KKK author's book, The Klansman or whatever. But like, this is a guy who's like a Southerner who's pro KKK, and he wrote a very sympathetic interpretation of Lincoln. And people were like, well, how could a Southerner do that? Because they had a perspective. They saw what Lincoln was going to do, and then he died, and then the radical Republicans got into power and did incredibly worse things. Lincoln would have stood in the way of that because he was already doing that. He was pocket vetoing stuff that they wanted to pass. He was like, Lincoln was very much a moderate. This is where it gets really frustrating as a guy who's actually studied history. Most of the catalysts in history are actually moderates. You know, people like, for example, Martin Luther, if you actually look at him, he was a moderate.
Well, I noticed that history often forces moderates to become extremists.
Right. And so Lincoln, I don't think was a extremist. I just think he was a moderate. He was moderate on slavery. He was moderate on a lot of issues. But he was pushed into positions kind of like with, like, you know, one could argue with Cromwell. I was just listening to a documentary on Oliver Cromwell where he was actually very pro-monarchy. But
hold on a second. Just, you know, I'm Irish, so be careful saying anything nice about Cromwell. So
The curse of
careful there.
Cromwell upon you, right?
Yeah.
No, I'm saying like within England's politics, you know, people were always like, oh, he was, you know, like a regicidal tyrant or whatever. It's like, yeah, but like, anyways, not to go down that rabbit hole, but like with Lincoln, you know, people were like, he was a rabid extremist. Well, he did a lot of things that politically were extreme as a president. But what's funny is like, okay, so he did that, but then he won and it all went away.
Mm-hmm.
Like it just, he was like, it was a means to an end for him. And, so I just don't buy that viewpoint that a lot of these guys say. I think the Civil War was much more complicated than people want to paint it, where there's this like clear, you know, Saturday morning cartoon right versus wrong, whether it's whether it's the North, like the righteous North invading the South to keep the Union, or whether it's the righteous South trying to keep out the Yankee invader. I think it's like, guys, there were saints and demons on both sides. And, you know, you can argue that the outcome of the war was bad for the country. I'm not going to argue against that. I think that the warnings of a lot of people are playing out on that. But this is where like leadership is so important during a crisis, right? Like the Union could have been kept together. Well, I don't know. I'm not trying to play Monday morning quarterback on these guys necessarily, but it goes back to like Lee could have negotiated good terms of surrender. Going back to Gettysburg, he could have negotiated better terms. But, you know, I think that Gettysburg also, and I kind of tweeted about this, it represented the difference between the New England Puritan and the Southern Cavalier in terms of how they viewed war.
Okay.
So if you look at Joshua Chamberlain, he was a professor of rhetoric and natural history. So he was not a soldier. He was a professor. He was a writer. He leaves his college in Maine, becomes a soldier, and during this battle, he's tasked with securing a very important flank at the Little Round Top. So the Union was on this ridge, and if they abandoned that area, they would be flanked from the rear. And the basically the Union Army would be like, they would lose the battle and probably the war. Because then the South could have just, the Southern Army, the Army of Virginia, could have just marched onto DC, or they could have forced the Union Army to attack them from a position of strength. So the key part of this battle with Gettysburg, in my opinion, that battle was lost the moment that the South failed to secure the ridge.
That's an interesting point. Well, everybody who knows anything about the Battle of Gettysburg has heard about Pickett's charge, which happened on the third day of the battle on July 3rd, today, anniversary of that battle. Now, it was horrific. It was basically 3 divisions or 2.5 divisions, right? You had what was it? McLaws' divisions, Hood's, and Pickett, right?
Yeah,
they basically were. Pickett's division was completely wiped out, but that was not the bloodiest day of the battle. The bloodiest day of the battle was actually the second day when they attacked the flanks.
Yeah.
Now, my feeling is that if they had, I always felt that the North could have not won the war militarily, but kind of do what the Vietnamese did to us, for example, to the United States, would take away the will to fight. Was they shouldn't have attacked at all. You know, that was a famous quote, and it's in the book, it's in the film, and it was taken from a memoir that when Lee says, if he's up there tomorrow, I will attack. And Longstreet says, if he's up there tomorrow, it's because he wants you to attack.
That is a great quote. It's like, General, sir, if he is up there, it's because he wants you to be come at him. You know?
And Longstreet was some people argue like the quote unquote lost cause. A lot of Longstreet is somewhat scapegoated because some people argue because he was against Lee's overall strategic plan that he didn't.
They hate him because he turned Republican after the war. He became a Republican. He basically just like he said we lost. So like he wasn't going to stake the rest of his life to a lost cause. And so that's why the lost cause people hate him. But the thing is like, yeah, they go after Longstreet, except Longstreet was the most brilliant after Stonewall Jackson. I think Stonewall Jackson was like the most brilliant. He was probably one of the smartest military tacticians that America ever produced. He was just like Stonewall Jackson. I read a book about him and by this guy who was saying that he had a strategy for winning the war, which was to invade the North and and take the fight to them and then force them to the North to fight them, because the argument was the South has better generals, better soldiers. We can just win, and then we march on DC. And they never put Stonewall Jackson in charge because he didn't have the right pedigree in the South. This is where really the South started to suffer from, like its institutions, because Robert E. Lee was had more pedigree. And whereas like Chamberlain had no military training, but he was a man's man, soldier. He was a leader of men. He understood tactics. And so this is where I think the pragmatism of Chamberlain triumphs over the kind of aristocratic cavalier mindset that really dominates Lee's thinking on the third day. And really, frankly, the first day, when he's just like, if Joshua Chamberlain had been in charge of the Southern Army, he just said, guys, we got to pull out. Like, they're on the ridge. They've got the hills. We can't win this fight. And we're not.
I mean, I was, well, I mean, in fairness to Lee, I always thought one of the reasons, because the first day of the battle was an accident. I think Lee was forced into fighting. That was one of the reasons for this was, Jeb Stuart's cavalry disappeared on him, right? So, and and Jeb Stuart didn't send word back. So they had no idea what was going on. So they were kind of forced into a battle. I mean, for all they know, if they turned around and went home, they might have been walking into an ambush. They didn't know.
That's a good point.
So they really didn't know what to do. So the first day of battle, and they won the first battle. I mean, it wasn't a great victory, but they won, and they took the town. Now, the town in and of itself didn't have any strategic significance, but there was tons of food and supplies and stuff like that they could have, and a time to rest, right? So they could have taken all that from the town. And then I would argue that the first day, because it was an accident, there wasn't really anything Lee could do because he was blind. He didn't know where Stuart was. For all he knew, Stuart was wiped out. I don't know. And back in those days, you have to understand that a cavalry would be the equivalent of
the eyes.
Lee called it the eyes and ears of the army, but it was basically what a recon plane is in modern warfare. It scopes out the terrain, enemy positions, even weather. So those things were necessary to fight a war back then, especially if you were in enemy territory. So you needed cavalry to go out and scout the area, not just what's in front of you, but what's on the sides of you. And that wasn't done. So that's kind of why this battle happened, where basically a infantry battalion ran into a cavalry division, from what I understand. Right? It was Buford.
Yeah, dismounted cavalry.
Yeah, they called it dismounted. Yeah, dismounted cannons is what it was. And so I believe was that AP Hill that ran into Buford? I could be wrong on that.
I should probably look this up. I remember who it was, but he was trying to justify it, at least in the film, to Lee, that we thought it was militia. Then it turned out to be cavalry. It's like, not quite.
We honestly, we're not. So a lot of this was what we know of the war is speculation. But one of the things we'll refer to is both a book and a film called The Killer Angels. The film was made in 1993. You can get it on probably Netflix or Amazon. It's a brilliant, brilliant film. It's called The Killer Angels, and it's based on a book by I always mispronounce his name. It's spelled Shaara.
Yeah. So I've read his book, and then his son wrote several books.
His son wrote fascinating books where he takes specific generals and writes books on them. But just so those people, I highly recommend both the film and the book, because the film is a very good adaptation of the, it's a historical novel. Like, there are fictional people in the novel, but it's historical fiction is what I call it. And I love historical fiction. One of my favorite books of all time is Gates of Fire, about the Battle of Thermopylae, which is a historical fiction book. But it shows you what might have happened, along with, he did a lot of exhaustive research about, studying diaries and memoirs that survived the war. So we do know a great deal. Like, we do know about the reluctance between, Longstreet's plan, Longstreet wanting to disengage and redeploy, which I think may have not won the war in a military sense, but I strongly believe that the North would have just lost all taste for battle.
Yeah, and this is really where I think you have, for people who aren't aware, the South had the cream of la cream of commanders. They had the best commanders. The Union soldiers were probably just, in my opinion, they were just as good probably as the Southern soldiers. They were probably just as good of fighters. They just had the crappiest generals, and they were also forced to attack.
They were the early parts of the war. They were. I mean, like, for those people don't know, what was it? Fredericksburg, right? When the North attacked and was just wiped out.
Well, the problem was they would attack, and parts of Virginia during the rainy season, you weren't going anywhere. And in fact, I took a Civil War class in college, as I mentioned in a podcast that no longer exists. But the reason Sherman succeeded is because it didn't rain. That's it. If it had rained, his whole campaign into Georgia would have failed. It reminds me of that scene from Guns of Navarone, where they have this guy named Lucky. And one of the British commanders.
I knew TJ was going to pull out the old World War II movies. Keep going, brother. Keep going. I love it.
He goes, wasn't it Napoleon who, whenever someone was trying to promote a general, he goes, yes, I know he's brilliant, but is he lucky? The whole idea is like, luck is a huge factor in warfare. Like, that's how you win wars. A lot of times it's just chance or the fate of the battle depends on things happening. I mean, there was not that we're not going to get distracted too much, but in Japan, the reason they have the term kamikaze is because these divine winds destroyed 2 Korean armadas that were going to invade them. And if they had invaded, there's no way the Japanese.
I think it was Kublai Khan, wasn't it?
Yeah, and so they were trying to invade, and these 2 hurricanes completely wiped out the armadas. And these were within, not within close time frames. They were far enough apart to, like, you would understand why the Japanese would call them divine wind, where they just completely blew these things down into the depths of the ocean. So,
well, also the problem was they didn't build the ships with a keel. So, that's true story.
Mm-hmm. The point is, like, fate and chance are important. And so somebody who's just lucky in life, like, they have luck. They have that Mr. Magoo thing to them, So Grant kind of had that, but Sherman really had that. And so, but going back to Gettysburg, I think the North had just as good as soldiers, and they were probably just as differently motivated, but they were probably just as good at fighters. They just had crappy generals. I mean, Meade was not a great general. Hooker was, like, you had a bunch of, like, politically correct appointed generals. Like Burnsides was an abolitionist. Well, great. You're against slavery, but you can't fight to save your life.
Yeah, who is that Northern general? He's the one that took the wheat fields and was pushed back and nearly opened up a line in Meade's lines. He was the guy. I think he actually caught his wife fooling around on him and killed the guy. I mean, he was this real evil guy who just wanted, because there was a lot of people. See, like you said, so for those who don't know, there was a shortage of officers on both sides when the war broke out, but the majority of the battle-hardened or battle-tested officers who had fought in the Mexican War went to the South. They tended to be from the South, so when their state seceded, they left. So there wasn't a lot of battle-tested generals or just officers in general, never mind generals. I mean, I believe when Longstreet left, when Longstreet resigned from the Federal Army, he was held the rank of major. And then was when he joined the South, I think he was promoted to right away. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and then he became major general. You know, he was a corps commander. You know,
right.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, well, Longstreet understood the value. Like, you know, there's different different tactics in different periods of warfare that favors the offensive and defensive. Longstreet was one of the guys who really got that modern technology was favoring the defensive side.
Yes.
And he was thinking, yeah, we get into a defensive position, force them to attack us, we win, then we go to DC. Like, we march on DC and we can win. So that was his
Longstreet so wanted to be Meade, like in the center. You know, I mean, he just would want. He was like literally, from what I understand about, because you're right, Longstreet was basically a defensive. You know, I mean, he attacked too, but I mean, he was a master of defensive warfare, and because you're right, the technology of the time was totally in favor of the defenders. You know, you didn't have any air power, right? You couldn't bomb enemy positions, so whoever got the high ground, it was very easy to hold it. And so the problem with, you know, I do believe Longstreet was extremely half-hearted in his attacks. I could be wrong in this. This is purely speculation. A lot of it you get from the, you know, following the lost cause types and stuff. But I mean, if you're of that kind of mindset, if that's your overall worldview of strategy and tactics, is to be defensive, and then you're put in charge of defending, of attacking a position that you wish you had. I mean, you're basically, you know, your heart's not in it. Like, according to I don't know if it was the aide-de-camp of Longstreet or of Pickett, but apparently when Pickett asked for when the major in charge of the Confederate artillery told Longstreet, attack now or it's or you're lost. Apparently, Longstreet didn't even give a verbal command when Pickett asked.
I think he, I mean, the movie, we can only speculate, but the movie had Longstreet telling Lee, this attack will not succeed. It won't. No 15,000 man army ever made will ever take that hill. So he was operating from a position that they were going to lose. It was just, he was doing it because he was told to. And, you know, this is where Lee really should, I mean, if this conversation actually took place between him and Lee, that's when Lee should have really paused and said, you know, like, if we're not going to win, what are we doing here?
Well, apparently something like that conversation apparently did take place, according to Longstreet's memoirs. He didn't keep a diary that was survived, I don't believe, but he did write about the war, and I believe he did write. He's talking about Pickett's charge. He said that for that plan to succeed, he would have needed 35,000 men.
Well, not only that, but he would have needed more artillery. The problem, this is being a nerd, the Confederate artillery was smoothbore, whereas the Union artillery was rifled. So it was much more accurate than the Confederate one. So the Confederates were firing on positions with less accurate artillery than the Union. So their feu d'enfoi, which was a hellfire, it was a Napoleonic tactic. It wasn't going to succeed. They weren't going to be able to out artillery the Union, and so, you know, you think that they should have just fired their artillery while the troops were advancing. Like at the very least, create smoke, right? You just fire right in front of the positions and then stop firing as soon as your troops get into position. And then there's enough smoke. But the problem is they didn't do that. Like for whatever reason.
And another interesting thing about that that time was it was extremely hot and humid.
Yeah.
So that I mean, I don't know what kind of temperatures Gettysburg usually gets. I'm not familiar with that. I mean, I guess it's hot everywhere in around the 4th of July, but I know it had been unusually hot, and it was also very humid. So anyone that knows basic physics knows that the smoke would stay and cloud the battlefield. So I guess you're thinking that it could have masked the advance to some extent of the Confederate troops. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know.
Well, there was another theory that, I mean, if the movie is accurate, and I haven't studied the actual documents enough, I always tend to, being a reporter, I always look at firsthand documents and like the actual, real stuff. There was some who wanted to just go completely around the Union lines. So flank them from the far right or the far, left or whatever, like you eventually meet from behind them. And Lee was against that because he thought that it was just dangerous. You exploded. The problem is Stonewall Jackson did that very thing. I think he did that at the Battle of Fredericksburg. One second. Battle of Fredericksburg. There was some battle where he did this he took a small group of men and led this in this incredible flank behind the Union lines. And so the idea that wasn't possible, I don't think it was Fredericksburg, but there was some battle where Stonewall Jackson basically took a smaller force, but he flanked them from behind. And it was a very risky move for him to do, but he did it, and it succeeded.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that, I mean, there's some people I know who are more religiously minded on this stuff, and they said that Jackson being shot by his own troops was like a divine intervention in the war. Like that was
because it was probably Lee's best general. Yeah.
Well, not only that, but Lee or Stonewall Jackson would have had if he had been at Gettysburg and it had been him and Longstreet saying we're not going to win this fight, Lee would have withdrawn.
Right. Yeah. I guess. Yeah. He couldn't have two of his, senior commanders both saying this attack will fail. And then, well, I mean, maybe he would have. I mean, I believe both of them would have carried out their orders. But
I just don't think. I think that with
because I mean, the interesting thing about General Lee was a fine general. Just politically, just the way he was able to keep this kind of this ragtag army together, showed he was good.
Well, Lee was a lot like, honestly, I think he was like George Washington II, which is kind of fitting because he married into George Washington's family. Lee was strategically, he was sound, but his personal character and leadership was what was able to keep that army together for a long time. And that was with George Washington. George Washington lost a lot of battles. He suffered very significant defeats, but he was one of those guys where, like, even if he lost, you still wouldn't leave him. There was that famous there was a coup that was going to occur or something like that, where I can't remember what it was, but like he was trying to read to his men Congress's terms or their pay or whatever. He'd given a speech to them to stay, and they hadn't listened. So he finally was pulling something out, and he took out his spectacles, his glasses, which he never wore in public because he wasn't reading him out in the air. And he said, permit me to put on my spectacles because I've grown not only gray but blind in service of my country. And the thing is, that made guys in the ranks start crying.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that both Lee and Washington, how do I say it? Their troops loved them.
Yeah, I think that there were guys who when Washington was in, I said this on that one live stream. When Washington was in Valley Forge, there were people who were like criticizing his command. They were criticizing him. They were saying he can't win this, and he wrote a letter saying, if you no longer have confidence in me, I will resign and go back to a private life as a private citizen.
Mm-hmm.
And the discussions ended because they understood that George Washington was there for one reason, because he wanted to be. He wasn't gonna. He was easily facing charges of treason. And the thing with Lee is, like, it never occurred to them that Lee. What was funny is actually in the beginning of the war, they called him Old Granny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's part of what inspired him to fight, is to take the offensive, is because he wanted to fight a defensive war, but all the Richmond newspapers were calling him like Old Granny, and what was it? They were making comments about the spades, like shovels, right? Like Spade Lee or something like that. And he just couldn't, the president's like, yeah, you got to go fight. But that goes back to the Southern cavalier attitude of, you got to go fight the enemy. Like, and we saw the same thing with the Crusaders at Hayton in the Middle East back during the time of the Crusades, where they could have easily held out, but their mindset was, you attack, you constantly attack. And so Lee could have held out, but they decided to attack and go into the North. So I think that is where the Southern cavalier attitude really met reality. Right? Like, guys, you can't just charge. Like, being brave doesn't count for anything in the face of gunfire.
Right.
You're going to get shot. So, I mean, Chamberlain was the pragmatic guy. He said, okay, we can't run, we can't retreat, and we can't shoot. So let's fix bayonets and discharge. Like, logically, that's the only thing we have left to do.
I mean, they were apparently they were ordered that you can't retreat. And so they basically had no choice.
Right.
And they routed the Confederate troops as they came up the hill.
Right.
And I believe they were just about out of ammunition. So
it was like, well, what else are you going to do? You're out of ammunition. You can't retreat. The only thing left to do is fix bayonets and discharge.
Right.
And so this is where I think, but the thing with Chamberlain also is, he fought in other battles, but I think he just understood. He wasn't from the military. He didn't have that kind of background, which I think was good. I think
there was it worked out well for him, but there was many an officer that didn't have a military background that blundered and got, many people killed.
Well, like Hancock, yeah. But the problem, like, Hancock was picked, or it's not Hancock, Burnside's. He was picked because he was an abolitionist. Well, it's like, yeah, it's great. You don't like to enslave people. That has nothing. What does that have to do with winning a war?
Yeah, or commanding troops. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just basic soldier, being a soldier. But anyway, let's get back to the battle.
Yeah.
So the actual Battle of Gettysburg, because it is the July the 3rd. So the final day of the battle, well, I guess we could do a little what if. So the first day of the battle, the Confederates won. They took the town of Gettysburg.
Right.
And the Union, after that, they settled down. They didn't prepare for defense or anything. And the Union just used that time to bring up, I think they had, I guess by the end of the second day, they had 90,000 men in there. And they just used it to create this fortified ring in the, as they call it, the fish hook on the outskirts of Gettysburg in the high ground. Now, what could have happened, let's say after the first day, the second day, what do you think would have happened if they just disengaged? They could have just taken what supplies they did and redeployed their troops Now, I argued that was, I mean, that was, a lot of people say the smart thing, but realize that Stuart hadn't reported back yet.
Right.
So they still were blind. So that's another reason why I think Lee stayed, was they didn't know, what else, where else to go. Now, I think that had Stuart come back a day earlier, they may have disengaged.
Yeah.
And redeployed, and that could have turned the tide of the war. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. If anyone feels differently, feel free to comment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the fact that they had no idea what was going on in front of them or behind them or whatever, but you think that they would have sent out, I mean, this is something that Lee. I haven't studied the issue enough to know this, but he could have sent out like cavalry and said, you know what, I need scouts. I need you to tell me where the Union Army is and isn't. Can we escape to the down south? Like, is there an army coming up behind us? But the thing is, like, by the second day, they at least knew the Union Army was in front of them, but not behind them. Like there was enough troops to realize that. I think that by the third day, at least, it's like, yeah, we're not gonna fight. But at least by the third day, it's like, I mean,
by the third day, though, they were so badly beaten that they were in no condition to. Well, they certainly shouldn't have attacked.
Yeah,
that was obvious. But at that point, they had used up a great deal of their artillery already, and there wasn't any more coming. It wasn't like the North could just have it. There was. I don't know if there was any factories in the South. Basically, they just. I mean, one of the reasons Jeb Stuart. Is a lot of people might not know this, but one of the reasons Jeb Stuart so-called disappeared on him was he was out foraging for supplies.
Yeah,
and he did. The Confederates, especially when they were in enemy country, were forced to do this. They would overrun federal positions and then take all their cannons. So because they had to. That's literally how they had to. That's literally how they had to fight, and they were quite good at it. But the North never really had to worry about this because there was more being made constantly. You know what I mean? So, but what I think is that really that it was the second day, not the third day of the battle, that decided it.
Yeah.
Because that's when you had the most casualties on the Confederate side. And it also, at that point, the Union Army had totally, they totally knew the ground. There was not a move the Confederates could make without the Union seeing it. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's funny. I'm reading some of the stuff about when Stuart actually returned on July the 2nd, and people were saying, like, basically they lost that battle because of Stuart, because he could not tell them. They were operating really blind, and that that kind of decided all the stuff.
Well, some people could argue that the battle would have never happened had
right. I think
I mean, because apparently there's some confusion as to what were the orders that Lee actually gave to Stuart, because apparently the orders seem somewhat contradictory. And I mean, one was to protect the flank of, was it Ewell's division? And the other was to forage for supplies. So he was kind of given contradictory orders.
Well, so here's the other thing. So you have Stonewall Jackson's dead, and Jeb Stuart is out and about doing his thing. So I think that like it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't, because if even if Stonewall Jackson was there, I think Jackson would have been astute enough to say, whatever is behind us is not going to be as big as what's in front of us. We can push whatever is behind us away, but we can, like, we should not do this, right? Because he would have said, we don't have to win this battle. We just have to not lose it. And so that's my guess. I think that, but it goes back to like the whole understanding of, there was that one scene in the movie where Longstreet's trying to convince Lee not to do this charge. And he says, if we stay, we fight. And Longstreet goes, sir, he says, you know, right now there are boys coming from all parts of the North in the thousands, and Richland has no men to send us. So if we stay, we fight.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he just understood we're either going to win it or we're going to lose it here. And so my response to that is, if that's was his true sentiment in real life, like, you should have just surrendered after that. Like,
yeah, don't drag it out. You know?
Don't drag it out, because guess what? More guys are going to die. And also the terms of surrender will always be worse when you drag it out. You know, like if the Germans had surrendered in like July 1944, they could have made significant demands. Like, you know, we don't want any troops occupying our country. They could have said, we don't want the Soviets in our country. You know, we want restoration, all this stuff. And it would have been very hard for anyone to argue, like, because it just was, they didn't have skin in the game. Like, you know, the English were probably, anyways, going back to the South, like, it would have not been just saying, we will come back into the Union as we were. Like, we're just going to end it. And, you know, that's when, ironically enough, that's when they could have, I don't know if the whole slavery thing, the Emancipation Proclamation, when did that take effect?
That was after Antietam.
It was issued in how long did that wait?
But it only applied to slaves in Confederate states.
Right, but if the Confederate States surrendered before that.
Oh, but that was earlier in the. I mean, Antietam was Lee's first expedition in the North. I don't know the date of it off my top of my head.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. So, anyways, kind of my whole thought on that is that the South could have sued for peace and walked away with a lot, far more than what they got at the end. But most especially when Lincoln was assassinated. Lincoln would have kind of left. Other than slavery, he'd have basically just left him alone.
Yeah, I mean, Lincoln, I believe, was quoted as saying, "If I could maintain the Union without freeing one slave, I would do it."
Right, and that goes back to, like, you know, people like the older I get and the more I study Lincoln, the more I'm like, I don't hate him, I don't love him. I just think that he was wrong on some stuff, but man, that guy got a lot of stuff right. I think he was. Not on the Constitution, but like, I think he understood things a lot better than people give him credit for. They just don't want to acknowledge it because it's politically expedient to not acknowledge the stuff that he got right on some stuff. But yeah, it goes back to the fact that he was a nationalist. His ideology was nationalism. He was not an abolitionist. People don't understand abolitionism. Abolitionism was the idea that slavery in all parts of the Union needs to be abolished. Lincoln was anti-slavery in the sense that he didn't want it spreading from the South. He was like, he had a containment policy, if you will.
Yeah, no new states that were petitioning to enter the Union could have slaves.
Right. So that was his thing. He didn't want slaves in the rest of the country. It's like keeping the South and all that other stuff. So I just think that it goes back to the fact that after the Gettysburg, they should have sued for peace. But this is where the Southern Cavalier attitude really just got in the way of things. Because if there had been if there had been a guy like Chamberlain in charge, he just said, guys, we're not going to win. Like, we need to eat crow, swallow our pride, and sue for peace. And
yeah, actually, the term "eat crow" doesn't that come from Sherman's March?
Probably. I wouldn't be surprised.
But someone might know that in the chat or listening to this later. I believe that's where it came from. That a lot of these, it's funny because a lot of these, I'm just laughing because a lot of these expressions come from things like that, where weird sayings. We wonder how the hell does that make sense? Eat crow.
Right.
Yeah. But that I think it was meant. I think he said something like, "Don't leave anything behind, even a crow would eat," or something like that. And that's eat crow became a part of entered the nomenclature. But yeah, so back to the battle. Well, I mean, I guess it's hard to talk about any historic battle in human history without drawing parallels to other battles. Like you talked about when this would have been the perfect time to surrender because I guess the North wouldn't have a bloodlust, so to speak. They would have felt that they exacted their revenge for Fredericksburg. And
right. That is really, that exactly. Like they got their payback after Fredericksburg. They got their big win. Like give them, see, that's the other thing. The psychology is that they got their big victory. So it's not like the North would be having to swallow their pride and after a big loss. Like it wouldn't be the same as if they were being asked for terms after Chancellorsville or Fredericksburg, where they'd suffered a big defeat and like national pride came into play. It's like, no, this would have been after a very big victory for the North. And Lincoln could have given his
well, the optics were perfect for it, right? The North, the South came into the North, got their ass kicked, and were chased out, and now they want to surrender, and the North would go, "Hey, fine." I mean, it would be like they was, in that ways. I don't know. I think the North would have swallowed that. The problem is that I think many people in the South wouldn't. I mean, look, they continued to fight on for almost another 2 years. That says something about.
I hate to say this, but like this is where I'm not. This is where I don't identify and I don't sympathize with people in the Southern perspective. Is like. And maybe it's because it's the Puritan mindset that still dwells in me. But like after you lose, when you can't win, you cut your losses. Like you when you're not going to win, you swallow your pride and do what's best for the future, which is surrendering. And you surrender from a position of strength. You don't do this whole drag it out to the bloody end. Because when you surrender, then you have nothing to bargain with. You got nothing. I mean, they waited until Richland and Atlanta and all these other major cities have been destroyed. People's livelihoods have been destroyed, and
even Richmond was evacuated. It was.
Yeah, and this is just where I'm not sympathetic in a way to the lost cause Southern people who like have this victimhood mindset. It's like, you knew you weren't going to win after Gettysburg. You knew that. Like you all knew that, and you decided to keep fighting, and now you want sympathy for the fact that the North engaged in genuine war crimes. Even Sherman said they were war crimes. Like, I get that, but at the same time, that could have been avoided. It's not like you guys had a hope of victory at that point. Like when you know you're not going to win.
I mean, basically Gettysburg was their last gambit. I mean, basically that was invading the North. The theory was they would invade the North, win a decisive victory, and then ask for terms. And
it didn't happen. So they should have asked for terms at that point. Yeah. But the Southern Cavalier mindset was honor. Like they had this very perverted sense, not perverted, but very old-fashioned sense of like Walter. What was the name of that one author? Like Ivanhoe, chivalry. This very weird romantic sense of honor where you lose everything before you admit a mistake. And so I just don't think that was an issue for a lot of Northern generals like Chamberlain. I think Chamberlain understood because he suffered through.
Well, in fairness, by the battle, I mean Chamberlain was a colonel he did actually win a field commission to general, I believe. I believe they gave it to him because they didn't think he'd survive his wounds. I'm not
Right.
kidding, but he did.
Right. So I just
Um,
think Chamberlain, like, but the thing was, like, Chamberlain didn't have that same mindset that I think gets really toxic. Like this whole, we're gonna charge onto the field of battle, and it's not for us to ask why, but do or die, like that thing. He's like, no, we're here, like kind of like Patton. Like Patton, I understand Patton was from the South, and he like that whole thing. But at the same time, Patton was a pragmatist, and this is the difference between, the ideal Puritan versus the ideal Cavalier. Cavaliers are concerned about honor and bravery. The ideal Puritan is concerned about pragmatism and industriousness. So ultimately, they're concerned about winning, And so the person who's concerned the most about winning is the person who wins. Like that's kind of like what happens. And so like you see this in the South where they'd say, we're going to fight this war even though we can't win it because we can't admit failure. And even Lee, like it dragged out well beyond any point. Like when they're besieging your capital and they've taken your capital city, like what do you think is going to happen?
Right. Well, that was all the way at the end, but yeah, long before that, you're right. It was. I mean, some people argue that the South could have never won the war. I don't believe that. I believe they really could have.
They could have won it in the first battle.
Battle of Manassas or Battle of Bull Run, depending on which side. It's kind of funny. A lot of these battles have two names.
Yeah,
because they're named like the Northerners gave them a name, and the Confederates gave them a name. So it'd be the same battle, but they're different, different names. Because there was two battles of Bull Run, right? And didn't the South call them Battle of Manassas and Second Manassas, or something like that?
The South, the first one was a stalemate. The second one was a complete victory for the South.
Yeah, and So that, and I don't remember when the second battle occurred. I know it was before Gettysburg, but. It was apparently it was a total victory. The Union forces were routed, and they all ran. So there were several times in the beginning of the war, or where the South really had but they were. I guess the mindset was. I mean, some people argued it was out of political necessity to keep the army together because just the nature of the Confederacy, government-wise. Get troops to go. I mean, you got to understand what an invasion meant back in 1861. That was asking a lot of people from Mississippi to go and march on Washington D.C. I mean that was that would be like asking you and me to go to Antarctica or something. I mean it was it's hard to fathom. So there may have just been a practicality about that. Could they have gotten with the troops have even with the individual states even have committed to that battle? And also at that point earlier in the war, like you had pointed out earlier, a lot of people didn't have the trust in Lee that they eventually that he eventually earned.
Well, and that's what's funny because he was an older guy. He was from he had a pretty lackluster career, which was to his frustration. But he ended up proving himself. But at the same time, I think that this is where the South really suffered. Like they had great leadership in terms of their commanders and stuff like that, but their strategies were very romantic rather than pragmatic. Because their pragmatism would have been, if you'd been pragmatic, you would have tried to get an alliance with some foreign country. Like the reason that the U.S. won their independence was because of France. Like France joined. So it's like, okay, what do you got to do to get England? We'll say if we win the war, we free the slaves. Like that would have completely changed the dynamic of the war. Like said, if we win this war, we free our slaves. Now I understand for a lot of wealthy slave owners, they'd have been pissed off, but it's like you got to turn to them and say, just shut your face and go sit in the corner because you're not fighting because under Southern conscription, they weren't required to fight. It was the poor Southerner who was required to fight. This is another reason why I get, very unsympathetic because the South actually started conscription before the North. on that kind of stuff. But they exempted slave owners, the guys who had the most skin in the game. I promise you, if they had forced slave owners to go fight, the war would have ended much sooner, I think.
Yeah, well, Jews are not very good in combat, generally speaking, before the state of Israel. So, which we won't go there. Won't touch that.
Right.
But you just look at the statistics of the ethnicity of slave owners. But
you
anyway,
won't see that in Gone with the Wind.
No, you won't see that. No. That was yeah, right. That's funny. But but what I was going to say, but just in a practical sense, you're right, because they could even said to the slave owners, look, you're not going to have this mansion anymore if we lose anyway. So
exactly. It's like, dude,
you might have to free the slaves, but look, you keep the mansion and the cotton fields. Maybe you got to pay them a little more, but I mean, hey,
I know it's crazy. You have to pay the people who pick your cotton. Insane. It's insane. Yeah.
So, but I mean, if you're presented with that option, you're going to say, all right, I don't like it, but I'll take it. It beats the alternative, right? So, but
I think that if Stonewall Jackson hadn't died, and there had been a bunch of like non or pro-pragmatic guys and been like, okay, guys, we're going to have to, slavery is going to end. It's a question of, are we going to do it, or are these guys going to do it? And are we going to do it as a separate country, or are we going to do it as a, conquered nation? And this is where Stonewall Jackson, I think, would have had the balls as a slave owner himself. He could have gone and said, guys, we're freeing our slaves. We're going to do it this way. We're not asking you, by the way. We have an army, and
yeah,
I have an army behind me. You have jack squat. And the thing is, if they had said that, if we win this war, we are committed to emancipation. They could have done it through a compensation stuff. But again, that's a thing that they could have done as part of a negotiated peace, saying, hey guys, we will come back to the Union and we will even give up slavery with compensation. But they didn't even get that when they lost. They didn't get compensation.
No, they didn't get anything. I mean, and after Lincoln's death, I mean, you had the Reconstruction in the South, which was just horrific on the Southerners. But
right,
like you said, there was a bloodlust in the North because the war was, a lot of people, and rightly so, felt that the war was dragged on so much that I mean, it was just horrific. So they, but like the point I made, if it would have been perfect time for the South to surrender after Gettysburg, because the South could say, yeah, and the North, I mean, basically it would have been really hard to convince, because look, up until Gettysburg, war was support for the war. Well, it had been waning the whole time. A lot of people were reluctant about going to war. But when the bodies started to really pile up, and they had been, especially, you look at Fredericksburg, Antietam was a huge battle too, and actually Lee lost a quarter of his army at the Battle of Antietam.
Right.
But the South had, the North had, I think it was McClellan, which was in charge of the North, and he was, God, they had a lot of fuck ups in the.
Well, you know what's crazy though is Lee was asked after the war which general he thought was the best, and he didn't say it was Grant. He said that's easy. It's McClellan.
Really? Why?
Because McClellan, I mean, if you think about it, Grant suffered much higher casualties compared to the Southern. He was just willing to.
That was the joke. You know what Lincoln said about McClellan? He goes, "I'd hold his horse if he'd only fight."
The thing about McClellan's men, he was incredibly popular with the Union Army because he would not send his troops to go die in a fight that a lopsided fight. And so whereas Grant was and now the part of this is probably the interpretation of Southerners, was just he was willing to lose the amount of men necessary to win. McClellan was not willing to do that. And so his men understood that he would not sacrifice them like that. And so he was incredibly popular with the soldiers. He was called Little Mac, and they admired him a lot. But that's the problem, is with the North, either you're going to throw a lot of men into a fight and they're going to die, or you just go home. And Grant was like, drinking whiskey, smoking cigars. He's like, yeah, I'll do it. Sherman was like, yeah, I'll do it. McClellan was not on board with that. He didn't want to lose his men.
Well, McClellan had the wrong mindset, according to Lincoln, because like after, like, say, Battle of Antietam, I think McClellan said something like, yeah, we held the lines and the Confederates have retreated back down to their country. And Lincoln was like, you stupid fuck, it's all our country. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. I don't think he said it quite like that.
I mean, it was the same thing but the thing was, people with McClellan, it's like, why didn't you attack him? Well, it's the same thing with Meade, after the Battle of Gettysburg. Why didn't you attack Lee? Like, we had him. Yeah. Well, the problem is, like, this is where Lincoln, I think is fair criticism. He's in DC playing Monday morning quarterback. He's not there where you've got wagons full of wounded. You've got men who have just survived a very let's go to the Battle of Gettysburg once again. Pickett's charge, according to Longstreet, he didn't even think it would get to the wall, but it got to the wall, and they broke it for a very brief moment.
Yeah, only one brigade made it, right? That was
right, but like, they made it, and the Union troops, I mean, if they'd been able to hold that position and turn some cannons, they could have swept the entire Union army off that hill. I mean, it could have happened. I think if things had changed, like, a lot of things could have changed that. But
I don't think they could have, though, because it turns out, from what I understood, there was a huge amount that the Union had kept in reserve when they figured out what the plan was, because
that's true.
It took a while for them to traverse the distance. So they figured out, what their plan was, and they were able to coordinate a big reserve. So I don't think they could have held a position, because there would be no way to resupply it. So that wasn't likely. But
that was a problem. It's the same problem. Like, the Union had strong interior lines, and this is where I get a little frustrated with people who go after, in World War II, they go, oh, the Union, U.S. Talk so much about what they did, but they, didn't do so much and all that kind of stuff. It was like, yeah, but like, you need to understand, their supply lines were the greatest in world history. Whereas, like, for example, the Germans could have gotten their supplies to the front lines within days. It took months for the same kind of supplies to get to that. So with the Union inside of Gettysburg, they had very strong interior lines where they could get supplies and reinforcements immediately to where they needed it to be. So yeah, that is true. That goes back to, like, why I don't understand why Pickett's charge wasn't done under the cover of bombardment. Like, why weren't you bombarding the lines while sending troops up?
Well, like, they actually were.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
They did do that. But the idea was, there was different types of ordnance too, right? There was ordnance used to long range ordnance and short range ordnance and things of that nature. So they did, but the problem was the theory behind General Lee's attack, or just what General Lee's mind was, that the Confederacy would be able to concentrate all their artillery in one place, blow a hole in it. So basically the Union, the Confederates and the Union would just be fighting, musket to musket. And he believed that was the weakest point in the Union line. Now, at the time the battle commenced, that was true. But because, like you talked about, good interior lines, they were able to reinforce it. So it really became a moot point. And their artillery wasn't as effective as Lee had envisioned it would be. So it was, but I back to the thing you were talking about the, you were hinting something about the people saying the Americans didn't do all that much in World War II. I concur with that, at least as far as Germany is concerned. I mean, here's an interesting statistic most people don't know. 80% of all German casualties happened on the Eastern Front.
Right.
So whatever fighting they did on, against Americans was, the Americans didn't do all that much, really. I mean, they were fighting Germans who, by this point, really had no air force to speak of. They had no fuel. One of the other things that people talk about how I heard all this like ridiculous propaganda about the Tuskegee Airmen and how great they were. Well, first off, it was so bad. The Luftwaffe was in such poor condition.
Planes.
It was in such poor condition that they were literally drafting pilots. Okay, can you imagine that? Like, you're drafted.
Well, there are two things they were doing. They had 2 planes during Normandy, and then the other thing that they had is they had to bring wagons out to use their experimental aircraft. And I agree with that, but like that goes back to like the supply line issue and the proximity.
Yeah, but here's another thing about supplies. The Germans had to make synthetic fuel. They didn't have the high octane fuel that their planes needed. That was the other reason why because the Germans had the best fighter pilots by far.
But I mean, that's I agree with you. Like, I would argue, and it's not popular to say, but I would say that the German army in 1940, like their military was the greatest military in the history of the world. Like the German military at that time was the best.
Yeah, after the Battle of France, let's say, yeah.
Yeah, after the Battle of France, they had the greatest military in the history of mankind. That to me is an easy analogy. If you look at their analogy, like what they dealt with, what they were capable of, what they accomplished, what they were able to do. Yeah, this is why people like make them the bad guys of stories and not like the communists, because communists just aren't scary enough. Like, in what terms of what they were capable of. It's like the communists are subversive, right? Like which is kind of weird, passive aggressive stuff. Like they weren't inventing like massive tanks or these huge jet rockets. I've seen some of them over on the west side if you've ever gone to the museum there. But like the Russians weren't coming up with V2 rockets or the V1. Yeah. Like they weren't coming up with these wonder weapons. That was all German stuff.
Wunderwaffen. Yeah.
Yeah. The Wunderwaffe.
Yeah, well, no, there's a lot of truth to that, but a lot of people don't realize that Germany wasn't as industrialized as many other countries that it defeated. It wasn't as industrialized as France or England.
No.
And the real reason Germany lost the war, in my opinion, was simply because lack of resources, specifically oil. Yeah, they didn't have any. There's no oil in Germany.
Right. That was something that plagued them in the First World War, and they were trying to address before the Second World War. Is they were trying to create an autocracy, and that's partly why they invaded Russia, was for the oil fields in Asia.
But they didn't go like the Baku oil fields, which were, it's like, if you look on a map, it's like if you go to like, what would that be? Eastern Turkey. It wasn't far from there. The edge where Turkey and the Soviet Union met. But they didn't try to take those oil fields. They marched kind of straight to Moscow. Was the
they were trying to win. They were trying to win it's like Hitler didn't understand like the last time somebody took Moscow. Like the Russians don't have to win; they just don't lose.
Right?
Like they just keep retreating further and further into a hellhole of ice and snow. Like. This is where I don't understand, like this is where I feel like
well, I do believe that if Germany had taken Moscow, because a lot of people don't realize it, but the czars were the people that really adopted the concept of trains. So Moscow was the hub of the rail center. So if they could have taken Moscow and held it, I do believe that the Russians really, I don't think like Stalin would have just gone to Vladivostok and then been able to conduct the war from there. I don't buy that. So I think that, they possibly could have won the war by taking Moscow. I just don't think it was necessary. One of the things that I think that they should have done was, and I believe this was Manstein's plan, was to take the Suez.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. That's the
Like in June of 41, if instead of invading the Soviet Union, they had taken the Suez, and they could have delayed. That would have given them access to oil in Iraq. It also would have cut the British out of the Mediterranean, and it would have allowed the oil that they, because a lot of people don't know this, the Italians had a large navy, but it was pretty much stayed in port the whole time because they didn't have any effing fuel. So and
Yeah.
so, it's hard to run the ship without fuel, right? What they could do, sail. So if they had taken the Suez, that would have, freed up oil. It would have totally made the Mediterranean safe for resupplying Africa, which, wasn't. That was one of the problems. That's one of the reasons, like, Rommel had to become such a good scavenger.
Yeah.
So they could have taken the Suez, and then once they'd taken the Suez, they could, another thing, if they could have somehow brought Spain into the war, or at least if the Spain had granted them passage to take the Straits of Gibraltar, then, right there, if nothing else, Germany could have surrendered on its own terms.
Yeah.
Because they would, because then it would have been, Germany would have pretty much created a fortress around itself at that point.
Yeah, I think the lessons learned from both examples, and particularly with with the South or whatever, it's like where you have an ideology, and the problem is like their ideology got in the way of reality. Where when you're losing and you can't win, that's when you cut your losses. Like
Right.
you got to be pragmatic and say, like, I can't remember who it was, but like people who understood we're not going to win the war, but we can win the battle. It kind of reminds me of like I'm not saying that the people like Vercingetorix from the Gaulish people were this visionary. I'm not saying he wasn't. I promise you he wasn't. But Dan Carlin was doing a podcast on the Celtic Holocaust when Julius Caesar like slaughtered 1 million Celts in Gaul.
I just want to shout out to Armored Ghost. Why hasn't TJ talked with John Moore already? There'd be more steel videos by now.
We'll have to do more. These are great. Like, I love the fact that you've actually read this stuff. Like, as we've talked about, I try to have these conversations with people, and they just look at me like I got lobsters crawling out of my
ear. yeah. You gotta go back and read the source material, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so I
so
invited you on the anniversary of Pickett's charge. I didn't just ask anyone else because I know that you're a history buff.
Yeah,
anyway,
I mean,
keep going.
Pickett was like kind of the classic example of the Southern Cavalier. He was the bottom of his class at West Point. He was not academically good, but he was incredibly charismatic. He was daring. He was brave. Like everything that a Southern gentleman was expected to be. And
he was kind of the epitome of that Southern. He was that, and his men apparently loved him, from what I understand.
Oh, he was like this is the thing that people don't understand. Like, yeah, he was probably not the most academic, but he wasn't a coward. And people will say, well, like, why wasn't he on the front lines? He was like, Pickett's charge. Where was Pickett? It was not expected of him to be there. He was at a house watching it, and I've seen the house, and I've been at the position like where Armistead died, like he was shot, mortally wounded. The house is not that far away, like it's within a rifle shot,
right,
and that kind of stuff. So like
he was on the field of fire.
Yeah, Pickett wasn't. But the other thing is like Pickett mourned the loss of his men to his death. Like he carried that burden with him for the rest of his life. Like,
and he never forgave General Lee for it.
No, so they met years later, and it was described as singularly cold. And as he walked out of Lee's house, Pickett said to somebody, "That man destroyed my brigade."
Yeah, that man cost me my division. Yeah,
my division. He destroyed my division. So, people like, yes, he earned, like in Southern terms, it reminds me of what a military historian said about his book I have. He said, the Southerners in Pickett's charge gained nothing but glory at Pickett's charge. Like they gained up, like there was no ground to gain, but they'll never be forgotten.
Right. Yeah. That battle will be talked about for forever.
Forever. And so I think with Pickett, I don't. The thing is, he couldn't have done anything. He was ordered to do that. Like he was given an order. It was just fitting that it was a guy like him, where he was. If any guy was going to be asked to charge on a suicide mission, it would be Pickett. Like he just had that Southern Cavalier, whereas Chamberlain would have like been reluctant, but he had done it. Kind of like Longstreet, like you were saying earlier in the episode. He was like Longstreet was not a Cavalier. Longstreet was just, I think he was more of a, I can't fight against my home state, but my heart's not in this fight because I'm not I don't think Longstreet was pro-slavery. And, I've actually read, for people who are wondering, I've read there was secession debates, kind of like how we ratified the U.S. Constitution. There was the Virginia ratifying convention. I read the transcript of the Georgia from my college class. I read the Georgia secession.
Debate. Fascinating. I've never read this. Tell me about it.
Well, I mean, they debated this stuff. They like it wasn't just like they just, the other day, like, yeah, let's do this. It's like they were debating whether they should secede from the Union. Like, is this in our best interest and all that other stuff? And so you have this fight between ideologues and these romanticists who have this kind of what's his name? I got to look this guy's up.
Look it up. Take your time.
Because Mark Twain actually blamed him for the Civil War.
Yeah, he probably was a man of great rhetoric that persuaded them to overcome pragmatism in favor of romanticism.
So Mark Twain actually blamed him for starting the Civil War because
what was his name again? I was speaking over you.
Sir Walter Scott.
Oh, Sir Walter Scott. Oh, okay.
Yes. So he wrote all these books like Ivanhoe and other books, but like they were very like, charging.
He was a poet, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. He wrote the book Ivanhoe, that I have the movie. I've read the book. It's totally rhetorical flourish. If you're looking for, like the villain dies at the end of the book of a broken heart, like that's how he's killed. And so it's like, yeah, he's. I think that that definitely contributed to people's attitudes because, like I was reading some of the Georgia these secessionist types, and they had a very romantic view of slavery. Like they kind of like almost prided themselves in how they treated their slaves. They're like, nobody else treats their slaves. It's like you're kind of missing the point.
Well, I think it was beyond their comprehension the way that they were raised.
Yeah, so I think that that's the problem. It's like, dude, like it's kind of like it just didn't occur. Like a lot of that stuff just didn't occur to them, and so they had this very romantic view of the world. They had this romantic view of life, and yeah, if you live on a plantation and you live in a mansion, I can see how you'd be deluded, but like. That's the problem with where pragmatism kind of comes into play, where you're not surrounded by people who are you're not their master, so they can say, "Yeah, dude, you're screwing this up. You're doing it wrong." Like you can kind of figure it out. Like I like Chamberlain's or Joshua Chamberlain. Like he kind of just and I use him as an example because like he's an example of like a guy who could just say. Yeah, we're like, this isn't working, so we got to do something else. Like, I'm not bound by any, ideology. Like, yes, we believe in the Union, but like, during this battle, we're not winning, so let's retreat. Well, we can't retreat because that's goes together. He's like, yeah, dude, I don't care. Like, we don't. That doesn't bother me at all. And he even got guys who were he was told to execute. They were deserters, right? And instead he goes up to him and just says, guys, like, I'd love to have you fight with me. But, like we're going to go to this fight and, I'm not going to shoot you. I actually, when I was taking a business class in college, we studied his speech to them because it was recorded or whatever. But like, it's like held up as like this ideal, like leadership thing. Right. So Chamberlain was he was a leader of men, but he was a pragmatist, whereas a lot of other guys would lead men based on romantic ideals.
Well, I do believe that, but wasn't Chamberlain like extremely religious?
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I I know this is gonna probably upset you, but like this is where I think like guys like Cromwell during the English Civil War, like some people I didn't understand this back in the day, but they said that the Civil War in America was a replication of the English Civil War. And the older I get, the more I see that play out in how it was fought, because the parliamentary kind of like Cromwell's guys were much more pragmatic than anybody else. Like the more hardline Puritan you got, the more pragmatic they were. Like, we can't have guys who are aristocrats fighting wars. We need men who actually know what they're doing. And I think that goes back to with Chamberlain, like he was religious, but like he was a pragmatist. Whereas other guys were like, oh, God will fight this battle for us, or we're on God's side, or God's on our side, or whatever. And it's like, I don't think Chamberlain ever fought under the delusion that God was going to win the fight for them.
Yeah, I was curious about what his personal temperament was like, because I'm not sure. A lot is written about Chamberlain, but unlike most people, I never found him as interesting as other people. I mean, I do know he spoke, I think, 5 languages. I do know he rose from he had no military training, from what I understood. He actually was a professor in
rhetoric and natural religion.
Yeah. So yeah, and it's not exactly he was studying engineering or political science or something. He was rhetoric, that explains why he could rally his men, right?
Right.
But probably rhetoric more in the Aristotelian sense of the word. But I guess I don't know. I never quite identified with him. I mean, I didn't find him as a person a complex character like I did like Longstreet, for example, who, during the war, his wife and I think 3 of his children died.
See, that, you raise a good point. Like, it's the same thing with Lincoln. One of the reasons why early on in our history, after the war, people identified him as like kind of like a martyr is like Lincoln didn't gain anything as a result of this war. He wasn't profiting like Thaddeus Stevens was, who was a war profiteer. Like, Lincoln wasn't making any money. His children were dying. His wife was insane. Like,
his wife apparently was. Well, apparently she immediately went off the deep end when he died, didn't she? Like, completely.
Yeah, his son had her incarcerated for a while. But like, the point is, like, people will say, "Oh, well, Lincoln was a tyrant." Like, you know what? Tyrants tend to enrich themselves, and Lincoln didn't do that. Like,
it literally cost him his life.
But also he, his sons died. Like,
his son died. Yeah.
It's like, guys, like I'm like the older I'm getting, the more I'm like saying, this is a guy who's fighting a civil war. His sons have died. Like, this is like, to have continued this fight, and then he ended it the way he did. That there's some moral character there, because please point me to a political leader you know of today who you think would have done the same.
Oh God, no.
Yeah, exactly. It's like there's no political leader I can think of who, after losing 2 of their sons, their wife's crazy, they've just won a bloody civil war, and their response to that is, I'm going to just pretend like they never left. And when he was directing orders to General Grant, he said, go easy on him. Like, that's what Grant did. Like, Grant's orders were to be as lenient as possible. So he said, that's why he said in his surrender terms, Lee will keep his sword. Your men can keep their horses and their guns. Like, all you have to do is just swear an oath of loyalty to the Union, and it's over. You can go home. And Lee actually refused to, he forbade anyone from speaking ill of Grant in his presence to his dying day. So this is where it's like
Well, it wasn't an Appomattox. Like, didn't like it was almost like Grant was in awe of Lee, like at the surrender.
Yeah, because Lee showed up in this spotless uniform.
Yeah, he was dressed to the nines. Yeah, he was all dressed to the nines when he showed.
And well, Grant was wearing a private's uniform. Yeah, so like, like look at the different. So, but like the whole thing was like with when Grant was saying to Lincoln, "What do I do?" and Lincoln's response was, "Go easy on him."
Mm.
And then he said, "I'll act like they never left." He gave his second inaugural speech where it's like, malice towards none, charity towards all. Like the guy was, I just get really frustrated with these pro-Southerner, like, oh, Lincoln was like the devil, the lying Abe and all this other stuff. It's like, okay. And then they always try to assign arbitrary reasons for who he was. And it's like, you know what, guys, I think that he was more sincere. First of all, I think he would trade in with any politician that you have ruling over you now. Right.
Well, I think this harkens back to like a point I was trying to raise, was that one of the reasons I think Lincoln is beloved by so many, well, up until very recently, now I think they want to burn down his statues, but anyway, it's another story. But I think is because he was a complex character. He did experience tragedy in his life. He did die tragically, dramatically. And there was a lot that, he experienced a lot of personal hardship,
right,
personally and politically. I don't know how many before he became president. I don't know how he lose all these different races running for different.
He lost that famous Senate race against Stephen A. Douglas, and one of the things, like, I get the point. Like, this is one thing that really frustrates me with people trying to, on both sides, by the way, left and right, who are like, oh, Lincoln said these racist things. Oh, Lincoln said these racist things. Take it out. It's like, dude, he's talking within the context of 1850s politics, and like our country isn't prepared even now to have those conversations. But I think that I don't, whether you agree with what he said or not, he brought up points that we can't have as far as like political points. Like Lincoln said, "I'm against slavery. I don't think any man should own another man," but he felt a certain way about the direction of the country that, even if you disagree with him today on that, it's hard to argue with some of the points that he was raising, because it's not easy to have two different it wasn't like having the Irish there, right? You have people who are from completely different backgrounds. Like, how do you integrate them?
Right. Lincoln did comment on that. I won't paraphrase it here so the video doesn't get banned. But yeah, he didn't really believe that, I think he said that both nature and nurture have created a divide between black and white. But who knows? But anyway, I do, but he was against slavery, and the concept of slavery, I think, is, it's one of these issues that, like, I find the concept of slavery and is abhorrent to me, like owning another human being. I
don't understand it. The idea of like having another human being, like their life is in your hands. To me, it really goes against everything that I think that's probably the struggle that a lot of Americans who inherited this institution felt. It's like they were Americans probably just as much as you and I, but it's like, what do we do? Because it's like, it's easy for us to, or at least for me to say this, but like, imagine if you were born into a family where you're in a Southern plantation and your dad's, because there was actually, when I was in that class, there was a family that was going to free their slaves when the person died, the head person died. Well, the slaves killed him. Like, knowing that he was going to free them was like, oh, we're free now. So like, that was where it just added to this complication of like, George Washington like freed his slaves when had them freed when he died. And a lot of people it's just like it's like we don't know what to do. And I think that it would have required at least greater character than the men who exist today. That the pudwacks, the retards, the spurgs, the idiots who, oh, we're against slavery. Well, this is what pisses me off about people who are like, we're against slavery. Great. I'm glad you resist the urge to buy slaves today. You stupid dumbass. Like, can you go to New Orleans and buy slaves today? No. Well, then, like, what are you doing? Like, you're pretending like you're taking some controversial moral position in 2020. Like, this isn't 1820.
Right.
You know, you're not allowed to do this. So how is that a virtuous position to take? To be against something that's illegal? It's like saying I'm against drinking during Prohibition.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Like, oh, well, that's great. You know, tell us after Prohibition's repealed in 5 years.
Well, that's why. I mean, I think a lot of politics, more so now than then, but even probably to some extent then, is fashion.
Oh, completely. I think that, you know, if they'd come up with a way, first of all, the United States government should have just eaten crow and compensated all the slave owners. Just said, you know what, we're going to take on the debt, but we're going to buy every slave and free them from the slave owners. We're going to forcibly compensate all you guys. They're all free. After that point, you got to figure it out. Or you could have done a gradual where it's like you teach the slaves to read, you teach them a very useful skill, you gradually integrate like a minimum wage, and then you free them. So like when they're freed, they've got an education, they know how to read and write, they have a skill set. So they're not like after the Civil War. This is another thing that retards don't talk about. After the Civil War, when they freed the slaves, a lot of slaves had nowhere to go. Like their only place they had to stay with their plantation because they didn't know anything else. They didn't know how to read. They didn't know how to write. They had no they didn't have specific trade skills.
Yeah, they weren't like a blacksmith or a carpenter or
Yeah, and so it's like, guys, you should have done this gradually, so that they had a position where they could say no to somebody who wants to take advantage of them. But they like this is where abolitionists, I feel like, were not thinking things through because they didn't live there. They were up in the North and it was all theory to them. It's like, great. Well, go down to Louisiana, go down to Mississippi and like deal with this problem because it was a real problem. And like, this is why Thomas Jefferson, ironically enough, Declaration of Independence, he was saying that was one of the grievances they had against England. Like, you forced this institution onto us that we now have to deal with. Because if you think about it, England had no slaves in England. There were no slaves. Slavery was not allowed in England, but it was the slave trade was permitted and slavery was permitted elsewhere, but not in England.
Yeah, in other colonies,
Yeah, that was the interesting thing. So that was one of the grievances that they had against them, was like, guys, you don't allow this in your state, in your country, but you allow it elsewhere. And we're now dependent on it for our economy. You know, it's kind of like getting it's almost like addicting someone to a drug that they got to go through rehab to deal with.
Yeah, because initially, you had an economy that was based on the institution of slavery. So then immediately when it disbands, the economy, of course, collapses.
Right. I wonder if so here's an interesting question. I'm interested in your thoughts on this, John. Let's say that slavery had never occurred in America. Slavery had never happened. Nope. But the English Civil War had. So all the Cavaliers are going to Virginia and down south, and all the Puritans are going to. Do you think there would have been a Civil War?
Oh, that's a tough one to make me answer intelligently right away. It would be a lot less likely. I don't know. Definitively, it's hard to say.
I think that there would have been. It just would have been over a different issue. Like one of the things I've learned in life is that when people fight over stuff, it's almost rarely over that actual issue. Like there are other issues going on in the background. I think that they would have fought over something else, like manufacturing versus agriculture, or should
there were separate cultures that were that had formed. By the way, Armored Ghost says, "Is TJ a mild-mannered Aaron Cleary who discusses history instead of economics and finance?"
Sure. Yeah. Send me money. Buy my books.
Yeah. Well, by the way, we're going to wrap it up soon. So I would like it if I put the link to your Twitter in the description so people can follow you there. You want to also mention some of your other works and other places people can find you online?
Yeah, definitely. You can go to TJ Martinell, MartinEll.com. That is going to have all my links to my books and my other stuff. You can go on Amazon. Yeah, and if you're smart, you can find the stuff. I'm selling all my books. You can buy the physical copies, and then you get the digital copies for free. So buy the physical print stuff, especially with what's going on now with censorship and trying to think of anything else. Like, if you're watching what's going on in Seattle, my books are becoming even more timely.
They're very prescient now, more so than when you wrote them. So check. I've you've also written some short stories. I've read at least one of them I read from terrorhousemag.com. I don't know.
I've written actually quite a few. It was kind of crazy. I'm curious if I'd be curious to find out if I'm like the most prolific writer at that site. There's aside from my novella that they're going to be publishing either later this year or earlier in 2021, I've written a bunch of short stories, dystopian for the most part. I'm trying to think of kind of my favorite, like Natural Rights is a pretty good one.
Which is the one about the AI.
Yeah. You can't write that, George.
Yeah, I know. That was the one I read, the one at Terror House that I remember anyway. Yeah,
you would probably like The White Man's Burden.
Okay.
Yeah, you got to read that one.
And those can be found at terrorhousemag.com.
.com. Yeah.
So you can check out TJ there. All right, gentlemen, we're going to wrap it up here. TJ, thank you so much. It was an enjoyable discussion. We should do this. We should do this again, discussing history and warfare specifically.
Definitely.
Another battle. It was fun, and it is nice to talk to some man that is somewhat scholarly on these topics instead of people who just kind of have a comic book version of history. So it's very refreshing. So once again, thank you, listeners. Please check out TJ. You can find him on Twitter or at tjmartinell.com, correct? He's a great author, a journalist, essayist, and check him out. Everybody, peace out. Goodbye.